really we start from the very beginning. We know right at the very beginning that the way that ransomware and malware was distributed was done in very basic ways. So floppy disks for the first one, you had to actually get a disk, you had to put it in, you had to run it, and you installed it. And in this case, instead of all the characters falling off your screen in a big endless list, what it did was it stole information and it locked your machine down. Of course, there was no internet to send that information to, so it really was, I'm locking your machine, you give me some money and I'll unlock it. As the internet came on, we did see developments with Melissa and various macro viruses coming down where they would both damage information on your machine, but also steal contact to send that out to say, hey, now you come and have a look at this. Now, none of those really made a lot of money. And the first time we saw this making the news in anger was Cyryptolocker in 2013. And the interesting thing here was that Cyryptolocker, number one, it encrypted data on that machine. It then demanded a ransom. And at that time, that ransom was $300, which, if I remember correctly, Jim, was the price of one Bitcoin, wasn't it?
Pretty sure it was.
So one single Bitcoin for $300, and then you were decrypted. Now, one of the interesting things here was that actually, if you didn't pay, there was a timer. And the longer you didn't pay, that $300 would go up. And Cyryptolocker also made the news. It made the front page of the Times when it happened. Then what we saw after that was the developers of these, they recognized they had an opportunity, but they realized that they didn't have the fresh to do it. So effectively, they established a partnership model, ransomware as a service, enabling people to buy their solution and then deliver that. And groups that we're familiar with today, like Lockbit and Revil, they were at the front in creating the organizations to be able to run these. Moving on from that, Petya. I'm sure we all heard of Petya. Petya used one of the NSA Eternal Blue exploits, which is an SMB weakness, which enabled people to get onto a network, to scan for shares, and to launch ransomware around a network. That was followed quite quickly by NotPetya, which was actually a Ukrainian infrastructure targeted attack that was launched. Now, the interesting thing here was this attack embedded the malware in a piece of software for an installer, some code which everybody had to use. It was basically tax software in the country. Everybody had to install that software to do their taxes. What this created was an unintended effect, as in there were companies in the Ukraine who did business and had to pay taxes, but that meant they installed this software and then they were affected by the ransomware. The one we're all familiar with, unfortunately, being the container company, who around 25% of their business was actually affected by this because they did business in that country. Moving on from that, probably the biggest and most newsworthy one that we saw was WannaCry. Now, WannaCry was big for a couple of reasons. The first one was the growth. It hit over 200,000 computers around the world pretty much in the blink of an eye. But the second one was that it hit the NHS, and it took a lot of computers around the NHS out of action. It, again, relied on an exploit, the SMB exploit, which had not been patched at that time, to be able to spread around the network fast. Now, after that, companies started to get a bit smarter, and we found organizations weren't so happy to actually pay the ransom. They were able to decrypt. There were decryptors being written by third parties. There were instant response companies that were helping them get out of the hole that had been created. And so the ransomware builders realized they weren't making so much money, so they had to think of different routes. And this is where double and triple extortion came in. A double extortion attack, if you've heard about it, is where prior to the attack, something is dropped onto the network which exfiltrates data back to the attackers prior to the encryption. They will then contact the people who they're putting the ransomware down and say, hey, we've locked your machine down. If you don't pay the ransom, we're actually going to release this data into the wild. That could be intellectual property, it could be sensitive information, it could be emails, all kinds of things. But there was that double threat of, if you don't pay us, then we're going to release your data. Then we came to triple extortion. Triple extortions were generally targeted at companies that hold third-party data, so it could be healthcare or financial or somebody like that. And this took things to the next level because the attackers realized that the data they had was actually private of people who did business with that company. So not only would they launch a double extortion attack, they would also look inside the data and they would contact the people whose data was under threat of being released and say to them, your data is in this that we've stolen. If you don't pay us a ransom, then we're going to release your data. If you pay us a ransom, we will take your data out if we're not paid the ransom when we release the information. So they're basically getting 3 sets of payment for a single attack. So that kind of gives us a brief history of where we are with ransomware today.